In the spring of 1485, a young woman waits at the English court. Her father is dead. Her two younger brothers have vanished without a trace. Her uncle sits on the throne they should have inherited. And now a disturbing rumor spreads through the palace. The king wants to marry her. Weeks earlier, the queen died suddenly. Some at court whisper that she was poisoned. Others say the king intends to remarry quickly, and that he has already decided on his own niece. The rumors spread so widely that the king is forced to stand before the mayor of London and publicly deny them. Her name is Elizabeth of York. Within months, she will not marry her uncle at all. She will marry a stranger, a man raised in exile who has never lived in England as an adult. She will become the mother of one of the most famous kings in English history, Henry VIII. But how did she end up caught between a suspected killer and a foreign claimant she had never met? This is the tragic story of Elizabeth of York. Elizabeth is born on the 11th of February, 1466 at the Palace of Westminster. She is the eldest child of King Edward IV and his wife, Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner whom Edward married secretly in 1464. A controversial love match that alienated some of his most powerful noble supporters. For 4 years, she is her father's heir, since no son has yet been born. Her birth is marked with a christening at Westminster Abbey, sponsored by both of her grandmothers. As a small child, she is placed in the care of a royal governess, Elizabeth, Lady Darcy, who oversees her early education in religion, manners, music, dancing, and needlework, the standard preparation for a royal daughter expected to marry into another court. But her family does not yet control the throne securely, and Elizabeth, even as a small child, is already valuable for a future political marriage. At about 4 years old, her father betroths her to George Neville, a nephew of one of England's most powerful noblemen, the Earl of Warwick. The engagement does not last. England has spent decades in civil war between two royal houses, York and Lancaster, and in 1470, Warwick abandons Edward IV and joins forces with the exiled Lancastrians, ending the betrothal along with the alliance. Edward is driven from his own kingdom, and the old Lancastrian king, Henry VI, is briefly restored to power in an episode later known as the Readeption. Elizabeth's mother, pregnant and afraid, flees with her daughters into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. 4-year-old Elizabeth spends months living inside the abbey walls under the protection of the abbot. In November, her mother gives birth there to a son, Edward, delivered without the ceremony a royal birth would normally receive. The following spring, fortune turns again. Edward IV returns from exile and defeats his enemies at the battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury, reclaiming his throne by 1471. The family leaves sanctuary and returns to royal life. In 1475, following a treaty that ends a brief English invasion of France and secures Edward IV a substantial yearly pension from the French crown, a new match is arranged for Elizabeth. She is promised to Charles, the Dauphin of France. She is raised for years expecting to become Queen of France and taught to speak French in preparation for a life across the Channel. But in 1482, the French king ends the engagement without warning, choosing a different alliance instead. The plan for Elizabeth to become Queen of France is over. Worse follows soon after. In April 1483, her father, King Edward IV, dies suddenly at the age of 40. Her 12-year-old brother is proclaimed King Edward V. Elizabeth, now 17, is the eldest child of a dead king in a kingdom without a clear balance of power. Her uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, is named Lord Protector. On the road to London at Stony Stratford, he intercepts the young king's escort, arrests Edward's uncle Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, along with other members of the Woodville family traveling with him, and takes custody of Edward himself. Days later, one of the late king's closest allies, Lord Hastings, is arrested and executed without trial. Elizabeth's mother, fearing for her remaining children, flees once again into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey, this time with her daughters and her younger son, Richard, Duke of York. Under pressure, she eventually allows young Richard to join his brother in the Tower of London, officially for his own protection and companionship. But protection is not what follows. That summer, a clergyman publicly declares that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was never valid, on the grounds that the king had already been promised to another woman years earlier. Elizabeth and all her siblings are declared illegitimate by an act of Parliament. Her uncle is crowned King Richard III in July. Her two brothers are never seen again. An Italian visitor to London at the time later writes that the boys were seen less and less often in the months that followed until they stopped appearing at all. By autumn, they simply disappear. It is widely believed that they were murdered on Richard's orders to remove any rival claim to his throne. And a knight named Sir James Tyrrell reportedly confessed to arranging their deaths years later, during the reign of Henry VII. But no bodies were conclusively identified at the time, no trial for their deaths ever took place, and historians still argue over how reliable that later confession really was. Historians remain divided today. It is still one of the most debated mysteries in English history. Nearly 2 centuries later, in 1674, workmen at the Tower discovered 2 small skeletons buried beneath a staircase. They are reburied in Westminster Abbey as the presumed remains of the princes, though no scientific testing has ever confirmed their identity. Terrified for her remaining children, Elizabeth Woodville keeps her daughters in sanctuary at Westminster Abbey for 10 months, living once again inside the walls that had sheltered the family once before, this time uncertain whether they would ever be safe outside them. But hundreds of miles away, in exile in the Duchy of Brittany, a distant claimant to the English throne hears about the chaos and sees an opportunity. His name is Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond. Raised largely in exile under the protection of his uncle, Jasper Tudor, Henry has spent most of his life outside England. His claim to the throne is weak, inherited through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, and a Lancastrian bloodline several generations removed from the crown. Still, he has followers willing to fight for him, and his mother works secretly in England to build support for his cause, reportedly coordinating with Elizabeth Woodville herself through a shared physician who carries messages between the two women. An earlier attempt to invade England that autumn, timed to join a rebellion led by the Duke of Buckingham, fails when storms scatter Henry's ships before he can land, and Buckingham is captured and executed soon after. On Christmas Day 1483 inside Rennes Cathedral, Henry regroups and makes a public vow. If he becomes King of England, he will marry Elizabeth of York and unite the warring houses of Lancaster and York. His supporters, gathered in the cathedral, pledge their loyalty to him as though he were king already. But back in England, Richard III moves to secure his own position. In March 1484, he negotiates directly with Elizabeth Woodville, publicly swearing to protect her daughters and provide for their futures if they leave sanctuary. She agrees. Elizabeth and her sisters return to court, now living under the rule of the uncle many believe murdered their brothers. At court, Elizabeth is given a place of prominence. During the Christmas festivities of 1484, observers note that she and Queen Anne Neville appear in matching gowns, an unusual honor royal custom would normally reserve for the Queen alone, a detail that later contributes to gossip about Richard's intentions toward his niece. For nearly a year, Elizabeth remains at court under Richard's watch. Then, on March 16, 1485, Richard's wife, Queen Anne Neville, dies after a long illness, likely tuberculosis. Rumors erupt almost immediately. Some claim Richard poisoned her. Far more damaging, rumors spread that the king now intends to marry his own niece, Elizabeth, the very woman whose brothers he is believed to have killed. The rumors spread so widely that Richard is forced to respond publicly. He summons the mayor of London, the city's aldermen, and available members of his council to a great hall. Standing before them, he declares in a loud voice that he never intended and never wished to marry Elizabeth. His advisors reportedly warned him that marrying his own niece so soon after his wife's death and amid suspicion over his nephews would be politically damaging, particularly in the north of England where his support was strongest. Instead, his council begins negotiating a different marriage entirely, sending envoys to Portugal to arrange for Richard to marry a Portuguese princess and for Elizabeth to marry a Portuguese duke. Richard also sends Elizabeth away from court to Sheriff Hutton Castle in Yorkshire, apparently to let the rumors fade. That plan never comes to pass. The rumors have already hurt Richard's reputation, and support for the exiled Henry Tudor continues to grow. On August 22, 1485, Henry lands his forces in Wales and marches to meet Richard's army at Bosworth Field. Richard is killed in the fighting. Henry Tudor becomes King Henry VII. But Henry does not rush to marry Elizabeth. He wants his own claim to the throne, won by conquest on the battlefield, recognized as valid on its own terms, independent of any claim through her. Parliament first repeals the act that had declared Elizabeth illegitimate, restoring her status as a legitimate princess. Henry is crowned king on October 30th, 1485. On December 10th, Parliament formally petitions him to marry Elizabeth, expressing hope that their union will produce heirs for the new royal line. Nearly 5 months after his victory at Bosworth, on January 18, 1486, Henry VII marries Elizabeth of York at Westminster Abbey. 29-year-old Henry and 20-year-old Elizabeth are married by Thomas Bourchier, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Bonfires burn across London that night with dancing and celebration recorded throughout the city, marking a union many hope will finally end decades of civil war. It is the marriage Henry vowed to make more than 2 years earlier, inside a cathedral hundreds of miles from England. Even so, Henry does not crown Elizabeth queen right away. Only weeks after the wedding, she is pregnant. On September 20th, 1486, she gives birth to a son at Winchester, a location chosen deliberately for its legendary association with King Arthur and the Round Table. The boy is christened Arthur 3 days later in Winchester Cathedral, in a ceremony attended by foreign ambassadors invited specifically to witness the birth of the new heir. His birth, arriving just 8 months after the wedding, is treated across the country as proof that the new dynasty will continue. But before Henry can crown his wife, a new threat to his throne appears. A young man named Lambert Simnel is put forward by Yorkist rebels, trained to impersonate a genuine Yorkist claimant, Edward, Earl of Warwick, even though the real Earl is held safely in the Tower of London. Supported by Elizabeth's own cousin, the Earl of Lincoln, and by Irish nobles loyal to the House of York, Simnel is crowned as a rival king in Dublin on 24th May 1487. During the danger, Elizabeth and baby Arthur stay at Kenilworth Castle, which Henry uses as his base while he gathers troops. Henry marches to face the rebellion directly and defeats it at the Battle of Stoke Field on June 16th, 1487, the last major battle fought on English soil during the Wars of the Roses. Rather than execute the boy who had briefly worn a crown against him, Henry later put Simnel to work in the royal kitchens. Only after this victory does Henry move forward with his wife's coronation. On November 25, 1487, Elizabeth of York is crowned Queen of England at Westminster Abbey, following a river procession down the Thames from Greenwich, with barges decorated for the occasion, one of them shaped as a dragon-breathing flame, evoking the same Arthurian legend used at her son's birth. With the throne secure, the following years bring Elizabeth a growing family, though not without loss. Margaret is born in 1489. Henry, the second son, follows on 28th of June, 1491. A daughter, also named Elizabeth, is born in 1492 but dies at just 3 years old in 1495. Mary is born in 1496. Edmund is born in 1499 and dies as an infant the following year. Despite being arranged for political necessity, the marriage between Henry and Elizabeth becomes, by most contemporary accounts, a close and affectionate one. Henry gives his wife beautifully illustrated books, knowing her love of reading. She becomes a patron of the English printer William Caxton. A visiting Spanish ambassador describes her household as large and magnificent, with dozens of attending ladies. Her mother-in-law, Margaret Beaufort, remains a formidable presence at court, holding a level of formal precedence and influence over royal affairs that some observers find unusual for a queen's own household, though the two women appear to maintain a workable relationship. Elizabeth adopts the motto "humble and reverent," makes generous gifts to the church, and is remembered by those who knew her as gentle, warm, and devoted to her children. But her second son, Henry, is not raised to be king. That role belongs to Arthur, her firstborn, who is sent to Ludlow Castle as a child to be trained for eventual rule as Prince of Wales. As part of a long-planned alliance with Spain, Arthur is betrothed as a young child to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. The two finally marry in November 1501, when Arthur is 15 years old. The young couple travels to Ludlow Castle to establish their own household, following royal tradition. 5 months later, catastrophe strikes. In the spring of 1502, both Arthur and Catherine fall seriously ill at Ludlow. Catherine slowly recovers. Arthur does not. A household account describes a lingering illness that set in around Christmas and worsened over the following months. Historians have since suggested tuberculosis, the sweating sickness, or influenza as possible causes, though the exact illness is still debated. Arthur dies on April 2nd, 1502, 6 months short of his 16th birthday. His body lies in state at Ludlow under a canopy of gold cloth, guarded by torchbearers, before being carried to Worcester Cathedral for burial 3 weeks later. News of his death takes 2 days to reach the king. On April 4th, Henry VII's confessor wakes him and delivers the news directly. Henry breaks down in tears and immediately sends for Elizabeth, saying that he and his queen would bear this sorrow together. When Elizabeth reaches her husband's chamber and sees his grief, she comforts him. She reminds him that God has still left him a son and 2 daughters, and that his own mother had borne no child but him. And yet God had preserved his life and made him king regardless. Her words are recorded as having calmed him. But after she leaves his chamber and returns to her own rooms, Elizabeth breaks down completely, and it is her husband's turn to comfort her. The dynasty Henry and Elizabeth built together now depends on a single surviving son. Their remaining boy, Henry, only 10 years old, becomes heir to the throne in his brother's place. Not long afterward, Elizabeth becomes pregnant again. Historians who study the period believe this was a deliberate decision, an attempt to secure the family's future with another son, despite the physical toll of 6 previous pregnancies and Elizabeth's declining health. One biographer has suggested that years of childbearing had already left her with an iron deficiency, weakening her body well before this final pregnancy began. This final pregnancy will end Elizabeth's life. In December 1502, still weeks from her due date, she orders a religious girdle believed to protect mothers and infants during labor. In January 1503, she and her sister Catherine travel to the Tower of London, expecting to give birth later in the more comfortable surroundings of Richmond Palace. On the morning of February 2nd, 1503, labor begins suddenly, weeks earlier than expected. Elizabeth gives birth to a daughter at the Tower. The baby is named Catherine. A messenger is sent to fetch a physician, but the birth has already proven difficult. Neither mother nor daughter recover. The infant princess grows weaker over the following days and dies on February 10th. The next day, February 11th, 1503, on her own 37th birthday, Elizabeth of York dies at the Tower of London, most likely from an infection following childbirth. Henry VII is devastated. Elizabeth's funeral procession moves through London to Westminster Abbey, accompanied by hundreds of mourners, torchbearers, and members of the nobility, in a ceremony recorded in unusual detail by the heralds responsible for organizing it. Henry spends an enormous sum, more than £2,800, on the funeral, and orders hundreds of masses said for her soul. Afterward, he withdraws from public view entirely, falling seriously ill himself in the weeks that follow. When he finally reappears, those around him notice that his hair has turned white. In the years afterward, he marks the anniversary of her death every year, with tolling bells and burning candles in her honor. Elizabeth is buried on February 24th, 1503 in Westminster Abbey, inside the Lady Chapel her husband had commissioned only weeks before her death. It is the same abbey that sheltered her twice during her childhood, once as an infant during her father's exile, and again as a teenager after his death. 6 years later, in 1509, Henry VII dies and is buried beside her in the same vault. Their marriage had already created something that would outlast them both. At their wedding in 1486, the white rose long associated with the House of York was joined with the red rose associated with the House of Lancaster, forming a single new symbol, the Tudor rose. It became the badge of the new royal dynasty and a lasting sign that the civil war dividing England for decades had ended. Their children continued that pattern of political marriage in turn. Margaret's marriage joined the Tudor line to the royal family of Scotland, a connection that would eventually bring the crowns of England and Scotland together under a single ruler. Mary's marriage briefly made her Queen of France. Her son Henry VIII, only 11 years old when his mother died, would go on to become one of the most famous kings in English history, remembered for 6 marriages and for the religious changes he brought to England. He kept one visible trait from his mother for the rest of his life: his red gold hair and fair complexion, inherited directly from Elizabeth. His own daughter, Elizabeth I, had the same hair color and complexion. A painting completed in the years after her death shows Henry VII and Elizabeth kneeling together with their children, a lasting image of the family their marriage created. Very few of Elizabeth's own words survive. Unlike her son and granddaughter, she left behind no letters revealing her private thoughts and no recorded opinions on the political upheavals that shaped her life, only household accounts, financial records, and the observations of others. Today, most people who recognize the name Elizabeth of York know her only as the mother of Henry VIII, remembered mainly in connection with her son. Few know her own story. A woman who survived a vanished throne, 2 periods of sanctuary, the disappearance and probable murder of her own brothers, and rumors that she might be forced to marry the uncle believed responsible for their deaths. She died at 37, having spent her adult life joining 2 warring royal houses through a marriage she never chose for herself. At the end of a conflict her own family had spent decades fighting to win.